Hello, ladies and gentlemen. You're back once again with the Economancer. Today we're going to be going into kind of a debate topic. So we have these two competing interests in our world, and that's nationalism or humanitarianism, and how they seem to be at odds with one another. So one of the questions I've seen proposed was whether a rich country wants to remain rich or get more affluent, or be humanitarian and care about the development of Africa or whatever country. Why would that be the case? It doesn't make any sense. Suppose you think it from the national unit as the piece of analysis here. In that case, there is motivation to build all of the most critical stuff in your own country, self-reliance and other considerations. Furthermore, abstracting from the national to the geopolitical creates arguments such as self-defense or infrastructure, leads one to think you cannot rely on trade for these objectives. So the premise is that because of geopolitical constraints, trading for goods and services means you are then at the behest of some other country and cannot be bound by these considerations because they seem to be against you at odds. So we have this debate, prioritizing self-reliance or engaging in international trade and cooperation for economic development. This is a very long-standing debate. So this video essay will examine whether a wealthy nation should prioritize its own economic interests or engage in humanitarian efforts and support for the development of other countries. The argument for self-reliance assumes that a government can protect itself by producing everything it needs domestically without relying on trade. However, the argument ignores the reality of resource constraints and the importance of international trade for economic growth. Further, we're also going to explore the idea of free trade or capitalism as a communal ontology and how it relates to the benefits of trade and cooperation. Finally, we're going to discuss trade efficiency in the real world and why it tends to have better outcomes than self-reliance. We will discuss some significant problems with this type of internalized thinking. First, we will look at not just the productivity of resources, but the resource exchange and why that would also impact the problem of self-sufficiency. We'll also discuss, like I said, this communal ontology and why that extends beyond borders. And then we'll also discuss the nature of exchange and what would be the most efficient in a perfect world and in the real world. When trying to argue that self-sufficiency provides an argument for internal protection, our first argument assumes that the nation has the vast raw material to utilize. For example, the USA is a fairly rich, resource-abundant country. Still, many countries do not have the same access to the same levels of raw materials. Furthermore, the US does not have access to all raw materials needed, such as platinum or other precious metals. So how does one protect themselves from the inability to obtain those materials without trade? I'm sure the counter-argument is that we are only talking about production. But production necessitates the material to be used for producing. So we are back at the first problem, especially as someone would reference Australia as if they have as many resources at their disposal. So again, we go back to the problem of how we are to protect ourselves as the national unit from trade barriers if we cannot get those raw materials. We cannot just alchemically produce them or steal them, which some people may be okay with stealing. I'm not. So the only obvious solution is trade. Now, why is trade important in this, especially when we discuss geopolitics? Rather than relying on a naive analysis of power, we can expand the context. So we have military power, trade power, political power, etc. Some countries may be more endowed in one area than others, but there is no absolute advantage. And even if there is an absolute advantage, the cost of trying to deal with all of the other political pressures, military pressures, etc., would exceed the costs of maintaining the stability. Therefore, we can see that we get right back to the ordering of the world as it has been with the exchange for goods and services internationally. Though there may be a preference for internal reliance, it does not exceed the willingness to trade and be in communion with other nations, especially those with whom you share interests. Using that idea, we're going to reflect on this communal ontology by explaining Adam Smith's work. Adam Smith's view on morality being innate to human nature and arising from our innate capacity for sympathy and desire for the approval of others can be seen as compatible with the idea that there is a divine authority that wrote the law on man's heart. Some scholars argue that Smith's views can be understood as a form of natural theology, in which the laws of nature and the moral sentiments that arise from human nature are seen as evidence of a divine creator and designer. However, it's important to note that Adam Smith did not explicitly make this connection in his writing and did not rely on religious doctrine to explain his theories of morality and economics. He rather emphasized the observation of human behavior and the functioning of society to understand moral principles and the societal organizations apart from them. The idea of moral sense is innate in human nature and arising from our innate capacity for sympathy and the desire for the approval of others is this naturalistic explanation of morality that doesn't rely on religious doctrine, even though I would be remiss if I didn't say that I think it does come from a transcendent morality giver. Now, Adam Smith's views of capitalism can be seen as communally driven ontology in the sense that it emphasizes the importance of social and economic interactions. In the shaping the nature of the human society, Smith's famous work, The Wealth of Nations, argued that free market capitalism was the most efficient and effective way to organize activity and promote the well-being of society as a whole. However, Smith did not view capitalism as simply a system of individual self-interest and competition. Instead, he emphasized the importance of social cooperation and collaboration in the marketplace. Smith argued that pursuing individual self-interest could lead to positive outcomes for society as a whole, but only if individuals could cooperate and engage in voluntary exchange. Also, something to note here, when we try to take down what is community down to the very most basic place and how humans interact, the first thing that we have to understand is that humans interact through exchange. And what do I mean by this? Communication is an exchange of information. Capitalism or free market or whatever is an exchange of resources between. We've seen this in the natural world, down to almost non-sentient beings such as fungus and trees will have an exchange mechanism where they will barter, they will try to figure out how much they can get for how much nutrients they can get to exchange with each other. So one of the most primary and basic components of existence is this exchange. And if you've watched any of my videos on communications, you can see why I think this way. Communication is an essential part of our being, whether that is an exchange with the energies of God, or whether that is exchange in energies or communications between people. All of it is based on exchange. Moving together through exchange, to me, is the quintessential piece of communal ontology. Furthermore, Smith believed that the success of capitalism depended on a set of shared moral principles, something people tend to forget, such as honesty, trust, and fairness, that were necessary for economic interactions. These moral principles were essential for creating a social environment where individuals could trust one another and engage in mutually beneficial economic transactions. Again, the idea is that these transactions are mutually beneficial. If they're not mutually beneficial, there's some type of coercion in there, whether it's power dynamic, etc. Those are not good. In this sense, Smith's view of capitalism can be seen as a communally driven ontology, as it emphasizes the importance of social and economic interactions in shaping the nature of human society. Smith believed that the success of capitalism depended on creating a shared social and moral framework that facilitated trust and cooperation among individuals, rather than relying on individual self-interest and competition, as many people seem to believe. We can extend this to the national level as it pertains to the geopolitical. All you do is just change the unit of analysis from the person up. So for the third argument, we can briefly discuss efficiency in economics and why trade tends to have better outcomes. To consider trade, we must understand that trade theory is the basis of Adam Smith's work in economics and the principle of economics itself. You can define economics as allocating resources and their alternative uses, or studying the communication system for resources and their constraints. Either way, fundamentally, you are studying the exchange of things and other ways to use those things. So a brief introduction to the three general frameworks for international trade theory. That would be Adam Smith's absolute advantage, Ricardo's comparative advantage, and then you have the Heckscher-Ohlin model. The Heckscher-Ohlin model encapsulates stuff like new trade theory. So this is great. You got new trade theory, new trade theory, new classical trade theory. And yeah, you just keep stacking new on it and putting something rather novel in there, and you get a whole new theory. It's wild. Nobody loves economics more than me. So what is proposed is the intervention to the market based on some post hoc justification. But just about anything can be justified if they already believe it, right? So I can already justify whatever my belief is, even if it's not grounded in any type of reason when I make that decision. I can go back and ground that decision in reasons through post hoc justification, which is what I see a lot of times when it comes to this national versus international arguments. So when is it more likely that government involvement is beneficial? So if you look at new trade theory, this would be determined by like regional hierarchy, because interventions would impact different scales and directions based on the regional context. However, from basic economics to empirical observations, we know that countries who trade integrate more firms, sustain economic growth, and have the impact of institutional innovation. So you can think of this as trading with the country, you are more likely to adopt some of their norms, values, and institutions. Which we go back to the communications for a moment. We see that trade also shares culture, because this implies the necessity of double contingency, where mutual understanding creates meaning. And that may seem like a bunch of gibberish, but you have to think about it this way. If I'm trading with a country, and let's say we don't really like each other, over time we're going to like each other more because we're trying to do this thing that's mutually beneficial to both of us. There's always the problem that we may stab each other in the back or something along that line, but the idea is that over time we become more and more like each other. Like imagine this, you come across your best friend for the first time in your life. Y'all first meet each other. We hear this often. Oh, I hated this guy. We were worst enemies. And then one day, boom, we became best friends. And ever since then, we've just gotten closer and closer and closer. The same thing happens with countries. Again, all we're doing is just expanding the unit of analysis. And that's again, because we have like people can't talk to organizations, so on and so forth, but countries can talk to countries. Yeah, but that's the big thing here. And another thing to think about this when we're talking about these trades, let's say we're going to cut off a country from trade. Russia, for example, back in the USSR. What did this do? Well, it allowed Russia to build its own internal trade system with countries that were against us. So now we have these two build up of these countries that are internally trading within their region or their ideological context. And there's not any dispersion of those two different ideologies against each other, so there's no dialectic. The only thing we have is they're instantiating what they want in their worldview, we're instantiating what we want in our worldview, and there's no communication between the two that is mutually understandable between the two, because at some point in time you're running into this idea that you don't even have a language to speak to each other because you're not willing to exchange, which again, communication is just exchange of information. The same can be said for the exchange of resources and information, such as human capital. So, in conclusion, the debate between self-reliance and international trade remains complex. There's plenty of arguments for prioritizing domestic production. But the reality of resource constraints and the benefits of trade and cooperation cannot just simply be ignored. Furthermore, if we really want to push this communal ontology, we need to emphasize the importance of social and economic interactions in shaping human society, and this is the big success of capitalism. Finally, trade theory is the basis of economics, and the principle of trade tends to have better outcomes in the real world. Therefore, it is my argument that countries need to engage in international trade and cooperation while also working towards developing other nations, even if that does have somewhat of a negative impact, which we'll eventually do a video on whether there is an actual negative impact, because I don't think there is. This is kind of that closed pie fallacy. The pie gets bigger just because I take a slice of it. That doesn't mean I've actually took anything from it, because the pie is just getting bigger. But we'll get to that in another day. And I plan on doing more along this lines of looking at international trade theory down the lines, also adding in more on this triple helix model that I'm going into, because all of this is really important in understanding economics, communications, cybernetics, so on and so forth. So if you like this content, please like, share, subscribe, send it out to a lot of people, because I think they'll enjoy this. Especially send it to your friend who's, really against this international trade, is MAGA, America first kind of thing. Try to get him to understand that, yes, we do need to care about our people. Yes, we do need to care about this internal structure, but let's not forget that there are other people in this world, and that if we're trying to build this communal ontology where we're all coming together for the eschaton, probably best that we not try to separate ourselves so much and learn to love one another and come together. With that, I'm the Economancer. Have a good one.